Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome to the stage Mr. Waddah Barqawi, EY Managing Partner, Jordan, Palestine, Iraq, and Libya.
Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, good morning and welcome to EY Entrepreneur of the Year Forum. On behalf of my partners at EY Jordan, I would like to thank you for being with us today. I would also like to thank our sponsors, Egyptian Arab Bank, Zain, Al-Mamlaka TV, الغد, #Arabia, and Endeavor Jordan and JSF. Our theme this year is public sector reform. Do we lack the will to implement? This topic in particular is relevant to Jordan today. Transformation of focused sectors and the effectiveness and efficiency of our public sector are vital to the success of Jordan's growth strategy. Sectors-focused policies, sound financial management, efficient civil service, efficient and fair collection of taxes, and transparent operations all contribute to good delivery of public services and increased private sector participation. Our panelists today will share their views on how to make public sector reform a reality. Today, we have a special keynote speaker who successfully implemented public sector reform in his country. He spent 9 years in government, serving as a Minister of Energy, Minister of Finance, and then as the Prime Minister of Georgia. While in government, he guided reforms in the energy sector, fiscal policy, healthcare, customs and education, and custom and education. During his 3 years terms as a Prime Minister, Georgia's GDP rose from a negative 8.7% to a growth of 8.4%. And Georgia's budget deficit decreased from 9.2 to 2.8. Please give a warm welcome to His Excellency Nika Gulari.
Thank you very much. It's absolute pleasure and honor to be here. I would like to thank EY for this opportunity, and I would like to thank sponsors of this event. It's a pleasure to be here for many different reasons, but first of all, thank you very much for giving me opportunity to tell the story about Georgia, about the transformation story of Georgia. I just want you to imagine a small country, relatively small country, with a population of up to 5 million people, with no major natural resources, in the middle of very difficult geopolitical geography, with many difficult players in the geography, with many ambitious countries around, and with very limited growth prospects. The question is, so how do you bring growth to this kind of situation, without oil, without gas, without any major natural resources? And the question that we wanted to the answer we wanted to give it was some kind of formula for growth. And I think the answer came on its own. And this answer was kind of regional hub for transformation, for reforms, for fighting corruption, for relatively low taxes, for logistics, and so on and so on. And this approach really worked very well, and I believe this approach may be a very good roadmap for many, many different countries. Maybe for Jordan as well, maybe not, but I think there are many things that can be learned from this experience. Not copied and pasted, but at least learned and adopted to new realities and to local culture, local society, local economic challenges. Just want to give you some figures of transformation. During this period of high reforms, average growth rate of Georgia was 7%. And that includes 2008-2009 period when we had the world financial crisis and we had the post-war situation when Russian invasion was in Georgia in 2008. And it's not an easy thing, by the way, for any economy. After reforms period, the average growth rate is somewhere 3.5%. So you see the difference between growth period, reforms period, and more or less stagnation period. During the growth period, our GDP per capita was quadrupled in nominal terms and was doubled in PPP terms. During the same period, Georgia's ranking in doing business went from below 100 to top 10. And Georgia is the only country that have managed to do something like that, to go below 100 to top 10. I don't know if you know or not about the World Bank's doing business report, which comes out every year, which measures more or less accurately, I wouldn't say 100% accurately, but more or less measures how easy it is to do business in this or that country. And Georgia was amongst the bottom countries in the beginning, and only within 5 years' time, 4 or 5 years' time, Georgia was already in top 10. And until now, it remains top 10. By the way, this also shows in some cases that these reforms are sustainable for long-term sustainability. Our FDI, foreign direct investments, went from 1% to 10% average. There were some years when it went to 20%. All the growth, one may say that maybe came from debt, but no. Our debt decreased from above 60% to below 40% during this period of time. So it didn't come from debt. On the opposite, I can tell you just before reforms, Georgia was a bankrupt country. Actually, literally, we went to Paris Club. I know the Paris Club kind of sounds very cool, like champagne, cognac, but no. Actually, Paris Club is actually means that country is bankrupt and country requested other creditors to restructure the debts. So from bankruptcy, we went to debt to GDP of below 40%, actually it was 35%. According to Transparency International, in 2003, Georgia was one of the most corrupt countries in the world. We were 124th out of 127 countries that were measured that year. More corrupt countries than Georgia in that year were Bangladesh, Nigeria, and Tajikistan. Okay? So we were like world champions of corruption. If there was a world championship in corruption, we would be in finals at least, maybe semifinals. Only within few years' time, I mean, even in 2007 already, 2008, we were amongst the least corrupt countries, 50 least corrupt countries. In 2010, Transparency International did the survey of 183 countries, asking one and the same question: have you or member of your family paid bribe in past 12 months? Only 4% of Georgia said yes. EU average was 5%. United States was 5%. The only countries that did better than Georgia were Scandinavian countries, Benelux countries, UK, which I don't believe, but okay. Canada, New Zealand, Singapore. That's it. Australia. So we were in like top 20, top 15 countries of least corrupt countries only within six years' time. What is very important about this transformation story is that only in 1 year, belief of population that country is moving towards fighting corruption successfully changed dramatically. In 2003, 77% believed that in Georgia corruption will increase. Already in 2004, only 11% believed that in Georgia corruption will increase. So this perception was broken within 1 or 2 years' time. And I think this is one of the greatest achievements, I think, of that government. Tax revenue increased from 7% of GDP to 24% of GDP. Number of tourists increased from 350,000 to 5 million. In we are talking about like 5-6 year transformation here in most of the cases. And the energy sector also, we had one of the most corrupt energy sectors in the world, and within a very short period of time we were electricity exporters not due to building new plants, but because of taking corruption out of energy sector and conducting this reform correctly. So every time I'm asked, so what was the formula for the success and for successful transformation? Actually, let me start somewhere else. Let me start here. I think this is more important slide to answer that question. So everybody agreed, international financial institutions, everybody agreed that Georgia's transformation was one of the rare examples of the most recent years. So what was the formula? Everybody's asking. And it's very difficult to give exact formula, but I think these 4 levers are main directions of how the formula worked. And it's meritocracy, it's carrots and sticks, it's leveraging IT and technologies, and simplifying rules and regulations. And I believe that simplifying rules and regulations could have been the most important one. Because our approach was simple. Our approach was, we are not a rich country. We do not have enough finances to have very large bureaucracy, very large government, very many different agencies. So why don't we simplify rules, simplify the bureaucracy, and give everything to private sector to lead? Just to give you a couple of examples of what I mean by simplification. Before reforms, we had 21 different types of taxes. After the reforms, we had only 6. All of them flat, and all of them simple. Why flat and simple is important? So you do not give double interpretation to taxmen. If you give double interpretation right to taxmen or to customs, they will use it for different reasons. Just give you one example. For example, if you wanted to import sport shoes in Georgia, you had to pay 24% tax. If you wanted to import sneakers, you had to pay 0 tax. Now, can you tell me what is the difference between sport shoes and sneakers? Only customs officers who take bribes can tell you the difference. And guess what? We never imported sport shoes for some reason. We only imported sneakers. And there were many examples like that. And these are embedded in big rules and regulations of the country, because the country is growing, country is developing, and there are more rules and there are more regulations. And one layer rules and regulations lays on another, and some people remember the old rules, some people don't remember the old rules. We cleaned it out. And this was very, very, very important reform. Before the reforms, we had like 940 or 950 different licenses and permits. After the reform, we had only 120. We cut down by 80% all licenses and permits. And we said that do whatever you want, unless it hurts majorly country security or majorly healthcare, the rest is totally not licensed, not regulated. So simplification was definitely one of the main kind of drivers of our growth. Another was definitely meritocracy. By meritocracy I mean it didn't matter your position in society. If you deserved it, you went up. If you deserved it, you went out. And I think one of the very clear messages for that was our university acceptance exams, because it was, before reform, one of the most corrupt kind of projects. You couldn't get to university before reform unless you paid something to somebody or your father was some close friend of somebody. It was done either through phone calls or through money. After the reform, we said that, okay, it's for everybody, it's same. We will give you exactly same tests. And do you know what happened? Students from poorest parts of Georgia did the best. because they realized that the only way for them to get out of this poverty is through this type of exams. And it gave this sense of meritocracy to the whole society. And it was one of the major reforms that transformed the society in Georgia, and there was a belief after that of meritocracy. It was about bureaucracy as well. It was about, for example, I was never a member of any political party. I never knew myself president of Saakashvili before that, and I became Minister of Energy, then I became Minister of Finance, and then I became Prime Minister by being a technocrat. And most of my government was actually consisted of technocrats as well, just as an example. Carrots and sticks, definitely very important. We came up with a formula when actually we just copied that formula from private sector. And I'm sure Ernst & Young practices this. If you do well, you get bonuses. If you don't do well, you are out. In case of government, if you are corrupt, you are going to prison. And this was, I'll give you one example, just to be kind of more clear what I mean by that. When I became Minister of Finance, my biggest problem was customs. And I think customs is a problem everywhere in the world. It's like separate mindset of people who work in customs. And they are, I think, they're very, very similar. And we even asked Americans, can you please help us to reform customs? They said that we can help you with freedom, with democracy, but forget about customs. Our own customs needs to be changed. So if you change something there, please tell us how to do that. So I did a controversial reform, which I was criticized for a lot, but it worked. And when your customs department is one of the most corrupt departments in the world, you need to do something drastic. And the drastic was the following. I created a special department which created shell companies which would import goods and during customs clearance give bribe to customs officer with a camera. If customs officer, it's not a big bribe, like $200 or something like that. If customs officer takes a bribe, he goes to prison for 5 years. And everybody knows that in advance. If customs officer doesn't take a bribe, but customs clear the goods, then we have him for the next checkup. If customs clear officer doesn't take a bribe, but at the same time calls superior saying that he was offered the bribe, on the next day he gets huge bonus and he gets promoted. Within 6 to 9 months after this very strange rule, I had the cleanest customs department in the world. But this was drastic. This was, many people criticized us for that because it's in some parts of Europe, it's not legal apparently. But you need to adapt to your own realities. And this is what I believe a lot. And just recently I was talking with Minister of Finance, and one of the advice I gave that it's not obvious that we need to listen to IMF or World Bank, because I know their experience is big, it's very global and so on, but one formula fits it all doesn't really work. And in most of the cases, you can learn from international experience, but you need to adapt to your own realities. And this is exactly what we did in Georgia. We actually learned a lot from Singapore's experience, from Ireland's experience, from Estonia's experience, from other countries' experience, but then we adapted to Georgian realities and we created this very strange new formula for changing and for transformation. So this is more or less the formula. Let me just keep, no, can I go back somehow? Okay, okay, excellent. So in total, some people tried to kind of summarize the whole reforms agenda in 10 different directions. It's okay. I believe this is the way to do that. But to underline my main ideas is that we were ambitious, definitely. We had ambitious goals. We didn't decide to do one or two reforms and wait for the next ones. We actually tried to do the full front attack on all directions. Of course, we focused on few directions, but the attack actually to do something, to change something, was all over the place. We tried to break the existing rules. And this was very important, because every time we would come up with some kind of new idea, we would be told by mostly bureaucrats, by people in civil service, saying that we cannot do that. Why not? There are always two answers, by the way. One answer is because of security reasons. Second answer, this is how our fathers used to do that. And these two answers always work. It doesn't matter what kind of new idea you will come up, the new idea will always have opposition inside the government, inside the civil service, inside the bureaucracy, because any new idea takes somebody's job away, or somebody's power away, or changes or shifts the power. And that's why it's very, very difficult to push through the reforms. I'll tell you about one more reform which I believe is very, very popular. It's actually Georgian know-how when we created Public Service Hall. Public Service Hall is actually a place where any services that you need from public, you as a citizen or you as a private sector, any services you need, you go there. You don't need to think, do I need to go to Ministry of Justice? Do I need to go to Ministry of Finance? Do I need to go to local government or so? No. You need anything. You need registration your company. You need register your land. You need register your contract. You need get passport. You need get ID. You just need anything from government, you go there. Public Service Hall. It's actually created the following way. It's actually front office of the whole government. We outsourced it to a new agency inside of the government, and we hired there only young, service-oriented people. Do you know why? Bureaucrats can never be service-oriented people. Very simple. Bureaucrats are decision makers. Bureaucrats sign documents and decide, will you get a land or not? Will you get the contract or not? Will you register something or not? They cannot be service-oriented. They are decision makers, and there are two different types of people, decision makers and service-oriented people. So what we did, we actually created a totally new agency, Public Service Hall agency, and where we recruited from private sector, private bankers type of people, young girls, young boys with smiles, with how to, and customs interaction with customer as a private sector, as a citizen, was done there. Actual job actually is done by back office. Of course, passport is printed by Ministry of Justice. Of course, driver's license is printed by Ministry of Interior, and so on and so on. And in the end, but the interaction with the customer is done only there. Now, many countries tried to copy that. And in most of the cases, they were not successful. Do you know why? Because the government members didn't like it. And in Georgia as well, government members were the main opposition of this reform, because they thought they were losing their own front offices, and they didn't like it. And they wanted to keep their own front offices, and until some of them were fired, actually, until then, this reform didn't go through. So in many, many cases, it's internal opposition inside of the government which needs to be overtaken in order to have successful reforms. And I think Georgia Public Service is one of the successful stories. By the way, in there you can actually go, and there's a cafe. You go to cafe, you ask for one passport, one coffee, and one cake. Somebody comes to you, seriously, I've done it myself. Somebody comes to you, takes a picture, goes away, and tells you then, brings a check. And you sign the check with one cake, one passport, one coffee. You go away, and they give you, and they tell you that tomorrow, please come and take it through drive-through, like McDonald's drive-through. We have exactly the same way. You drive to the Public Service Hall, you key in your name, and you take a passport through a drive-through service. So it's kind of new way of providing public services, but private sector is developing. Private sector is offering new and better services to public. And public's dissatisfaction towards public sector, towards government sector services is increasing because of that. And public sector needs to catch up. It's very difficult. Maybe that will not work, but this is something that needs to be done. Finally, I just want to give you a couple of examples of overarching reforms, which I believe made the major change into transformation story. And this is silence is consent and one government rule. Maybe you've heard of them, but this is also something that we developed ourselves. By the way, these are not international accepted terms. This is something that we came up with. Silence is consent means the following. When a citizen or a private sector is applying for a permit to the government has 20 days. If there is no answer, it's a yes. For a license, if the government has 30 days, if there is a no answer, it's an automatic yes. Do you know what our bureaucrats came up with? On the last day, they would give you questions. You would supply the answers, then they will also give you questions. And so this will continue for like 6 months, just like it was previously. So we had to reform the reform and say that, okay, you can ask questions only once. That's it. And after that, the counting or countdown starts, and that's it. After that, you can get fired if you don't give answer on time, because if the answer is yes, it should have been no, you can get fired. So, I mean, what I'm trying to say that reforming the reform was part of the whole transformation story. Always when you reform something, it's impossible to get it 100% right. Always there are loops, there are black holes, which public, private sector, or bureaucracy finds, and they kind of misunderstand or communicate this new reform. The second, also very important, I would guess even more important reform, overarching reform, was one government principle. One government principle means that no government agency can request from private sector or from citizen a paper from different government agency. If you want it, go get it yourself. So I think that was something that really changed the mindset of the public services in Georgia. Why? In the past, if you wanted to create a company in Georgia, you had to go to 9 different agencies. You had to go to Ministry of Interior, get a paper that you are not under investigation. You had to go to Ministry of Justice to get a paper that you are not under some kind of other different type of investigation. You had to go to courts to get a paper that you don't have any court proceedings. To Revenue Service to get a paper that you don't have own any back taxes. To Ministry of Economy to reserve your right, to reserve your name or so on and so on. And then you go to register and say that, can you please register my company after like 6 months and staying in lines in many different agencies? And when we first proposed why do we need all these different agencies, they said that this is how our fathers used to do that. We have to continue with doing that. But with this new rule, we told the registrar that now, if you need that, look what you need to do. You need to give answer within very limited time, and you need to go get all those papers yourself. In one day, they came and said that we don't need all these papers. We don't need all these stamps. We don't need all these signatures. We will send these stamps ourselves. And they came up with the new rules and new regulations afterwards, which was simplified. What was done after that, even without IT developments, you could go to the register your company, and registrar would send this information to Ministry of Interior, to Ministry of Justice, to everywhere else. If there was a problem, they would come back to you. That's it. So this rule, and in relations with silence is consent rule, actually changed the mindset of our bureaucracy, which I believe was afterwards, which pushed actually the bureaucracy itself to innovate. And that, in line with giving bonuses to people who would actually innovate, created this boom of new public services, of transformation that in the end gave to the private sector much more freedom. In the end, worked out as Georgia becoming a top 10 ease of doing business country. In the end, gave a boost to Georgian economy with a 7% growth rate without any oil and gas. quadrupling our economy, improving our jobs, and so on and so on. So I believe that this kind of formula can be used everywhere. Can be used in many, many countries. Not exactly copy and paste, but based on this, you could come up with some kind of formula which can be actually successfully in Georgia, in Jordan, or in many other countries in the region. One more, I think there was one more topic, one more reform that I actually also liked, which was also overarching. We call it piggybacking. And we used it first for import of medicaments. In Georgia, there were only 3 companies who could import medicaments. Why? Because there was a laboratory, and this laboratory had to actually check every imported medicament that can be brought into the country. And of course, only 3 companies knew how to go through these laboratory procedures. It was impossible for any other companies. Guess for what reasons, but there were reasons there. So only 3 companies. After some time, we said that, okay, Europeans care about their population just as minimum, just as we care about our population. And American government also cares about their population just like we care about our population. And their technology and their laboratories are much better than Georgians and much better than, much more updated than Georgian. Okay, so why don't we say that whatever is registered in EU, whatever is registered in the United States, in Japan, in South Korea, automatically is registered in Georgia? Great. Of course, some people in Ministry of Healthcare hated this reform, of course, and we had a huge opposition in Parliament, but we pushed it through. Do you know what happened? We have right now the most amazingly developed medicament import system, because whatever is registered anywhere in the world is automatically registered in Georgia, so you can import it. Now, we have importers, not 3 companies, but like 20, and prices of medicaments went down by 35%. And this is by the case study of the World Bank. You can actually Google it as well and see that all yourself. And in the end, the last topic, and this is where I came up when I was actually Prime Minister. I said that all my ministers will have key performance indicators. Easy to quantify, quarterly, and based on that, I will give them bonuses. There are only 4 stimulus that you can give to government employee. This is financial stimulus, which is bonus. This is public kind of appearance and giving them thank you in front of public. This is extra travel, and it's always a bonus, by the way, for many public civil servant employees, and it's a promotion. So you can actually give to absolutely to everybody in the public civil service, starting from minister all the way down to the civil servant. Based on these 4 things, you can give a formula which stimulates this person, which stimulates him to be better, to come up with better new ideas, to do their job better. So I try to kind of put together the formula based on these 4 things, and I told to the ministers that, guys, you, just like in private sector, you have key performance indicators. For Minister of Economy, for head of tourist agency, it's number of tourists that come to Georgia every year. For Ministry of Economy, it's FDI. For Ministry of Energy, it's export of electricity, and FDI in energy sector. And so it was like 2-3 key performance indicators, but all of them had 50% of their bonus, 1 indicator, which was, in my case, it was GDP growth, because I became Prime Minister when the growth rate was -9%. So it was like the biggest, most important and single most important item on my kind of checklist. Why I wanted to have 1 single indicator? Because I wanted for them to feel as a team. And unless you have a government which feels as a team, you always have problems. And this kind of gave to my team a sense of unity and try to support each other instead of try to fight each other. And by the way, in every government you have people who fight with each other. It's just It's just normal rule. It's that not without that. But still, you need to minimize the fight and maximize the teamwork, and that's what I try to do. And it worked amazingly, by the way. I would give bonuses to ministers, and plus I would give them money to give bonuses to their best 4 or 5 performance. Because there are, in any ministry, doesn't matter how big the ministry is, there are only 5 people who work. The rest work on these 5 people, more or less. I'm sorry to say that, but that's my experience. And just to give you a few final phrases, it's actually proven that reformers outperform non-reformers, and outperform significantly based on GDP growth and based on employment, based on development. And Georgian example is an amazing example of that you had a reformist government which brought amazing growth, and then you have some non-reformist government kind of with lack of experience, which brought stagnation to the country, and we've seen this. We are seeing this stagnation right now. Every situation is different, but great reformers have same DNA, more or less. It's also observation. And best reforms, unfortunately, are radical and deep. If you try to cherry pick small reform here and small reform there, it doesn't work. It's being eaten up by very fast development of the country. So you need to, if you want reforms, it needs to be deep, it needs to be fast, and it needs to be radical. Thank you very much.
May I invite my panelists to join us? Okay. Sabah al-khair. Good morning. Just a quick note that we will be switching between Arabic and English. So please, for someone to help us getting the headsets for those in case we speak in Arabic or in English so they can follow the translation. There is an immediate translation available. My name is Ibrahim Saif. I am the CEO of Jordan Strategy Forum. It's a think tank and advocacy organization aims at promoting sustainable growth and building bridges between private and public sector. This is like a commercial break that was not endorsed by the E&Y, but I felt I need to take advantage of this audience to tell you just what we are doing. The theme of today, public sector reform, do we lack the will to implement? And I think we could have never had a better introduction to this by the speech and the presentation of the ex-Prime Minister of Georgia, whom I happened to go through your book actually, and we have discussed one day a small short presentation with some of the youth actually that we're celebrating today, the ones that introduced us to review the concept of practical economy. By way of introducing this panel, I would like to share some thoughts about public sector and public administration. Governments normally sets the rules. Government sets the framework within which even our entrepreneurs are functioning and operating. The entrepreneur that, again, we're celebrating today, and I think E&Y is doing great role in promoting and supporting the young talents that are working in Jordan. I was about to promote the notion of productive government, but I like the concept of flat and simple in a way that you have used, Prime Minister, in your introduction. It's about how the governments are conducting themselves and how they operate. I think you have proved that. While you're talking about the Georgians' experience, and by reviewing other countries' experience in a way, we haven't talked much about the size of the government, which is somehow, as I was preparing my notes, I found sometimes it's not necessarily relevant, the size of the government. For example, when we measure the size of the government, measured by the total of public spending to GDP, countries like France, it's about 57%. Denmark, it's about 55%. Well, in Jordan, it's about 32%. So while we're talking about the size of the government and sometimes the burdensome of the government, clearly it's how we operate that matters, which is much more important than the mere size of the government. And even if you look at the indicators on world governance indicators, which measure the government effectiveness or regulatory quality in that matter, you find large size of government, but actually in terms of operation and efficiency are doing far more better than when the government size is small. So this is something that we need to focus on, and this is the theme of our panel today, by focusing on how government should conduct itself. Three things maybe we can focus on, and I think somehow reflected, but I will try to prose. Its input, which includes public finance, economics, public sector administration, and public sector employees. It's a process which includes strategic foresight, leadership, regulations, and institutional building. And finally, it's the quality of delivering public services, which is the output or the outcome of the whole process. Now, I would like to frame and introduce my panelists by just leaving you with three major things. That is, it's the context within which the government, and by the context I refer to the political and social context within which the government is functioning. And maybe we have to be realistic. Probably what has been conducted and pursued in Georgia, maybe it will be harder for us to pursue in Jordan. But we have, as you said, to localize that experience and see how we can do the shift. It's now e-governance, and engagement with stakeholders, which is unavoidable. So you really have to engage your stakeholders, and in particular, you have to engage your business community in the work that you do so you can achieve the targets. And also you have to draw on the international sort of experiences, and it is this, with this presentation that we started, I think it is reflected that the development and collaboration in that regard is very relevant to what we are sharing today. It is with pleasure that I welcome you today, and I'd like to start and introducing His Excellency, our good friend, Minister of Finance, Dr. Mohammed Al-Assis. The way I am going to conduct this is that I'll introduce each panel, followed by a question, and then probably we'll have a second round of questions. Dr. Assis is a former Minister of Planning and International Cooperation and Minister of State for Economic Affairs, has served as the Special Advisor to His Majesty King Abdullah II for Economic Affairs and was the Director of Economic and Social Development in the Office of His Majesty at the Royal Hashemite Court. Dr. Assis earned his PhD in Economic Development and Public Policy and 2 master's degrees in Public Administration and International Development from Harvard University. Dr. Assis, I know that now it's a hot time now for Ministry of Finance, basically. The government has recently adopted the notion of economic growth, and I think we should appreciate now the fact that we're really now focusing much more on economic growth and how we can promote growth. Given the fact that the government is in the process of endorsing its new budget, 2020 budget, I think it's probably within this week that the cabinet is going to approve it. Could you tell us how growth is going to be incorporated in this? What initiatives, what new elements this 2020 budget is going to include that hopefully will promote growth. The floor is yours, and I'll be introducing other panelists later. Please, Doctor.
Can you hear me? Yeah. شكرا دكتور وصباح الخير جميعا, and thank you for EY for this. I think it's a tremendous event. What a great start, an inspiring start really. Prime Minister, thank you for sharing your well-grounded experience with us. Yesterday the Cabinet endorsed the budget. We'll be sending it to Parliament today at 12 p.m. I'll have a press conference announcing its main aspects. Here are some key principles from which the budget was really established on. I had the misfortune of having 3 weeks really to maneuver within the budget. But I really wanted to send signals that we're moving in a different direction. And I think that's the key aspect of the budget that we'll be releasing today. Again, signals, taking a step. You know, it's going to take some time to get to the destination. Decades of distortions will not be solved with one budget. I'll be abusing your intelligence if I say that. But I wanted to signal to everybody that we are taking a step in the different direction. Step number one, growth has to happen. Growth is the way forward. Growth is how we will collect revenues. Growth is how we will get out of this economic stagnation. Now, I'm a Minister of Finance. His Excellency was also a Minister of Finance. And fiscal stability is at the heart of what we have to do. So many of you today will be looking at the primary deficit that we'll be coming out with, and will ask questions. I'll repeat to you what the Prime Minister said to his constituency when he was Minister of Finance. Trust me, I know what I'm doing. You said that, right? We need to stabilize the economy. Enough is enough. We need to stabilize the economy. I've heard you loud and clear. Stability of regulations and policies is the number one concern of the private sector, right? That's the number one concern that comes in every survey. If that means that we have a transitional budget that will get us to where we need to do, so be it. Number two, we will be increasing our collection of revenues by focusing on those who are avoiding taxes and customs, not by squeezing those who are in compliance for some more. This practice has to stop. We have to stop abusing success. The private sector is the only source where we'll be creating jobs, and your success is the only way we will deliver the objective of providing jobs and resolving unemployment and improving standards of living. Number three, we have to take care of our most vulnerable and those who are on the brink. That's why, against all odds, we have expanded in this budget our safety nets. We've increased our support for the National Aid Fund and the safety net, because the society has to move together in the same direction. It cannot be that this polarization continues at the expense of someone, and we need to signal that. Four, we have to invest in growth. For me to sit here and preach to you about growth is not enough. I, as a Minister of Finance, have to invest in growth. So for the first time in years, we have expanded our capital expenditure in this budget by an unforeseen percentage. The budget that we'll be releasing today expands capital expenditure by 33% compared to 2019's re-estimates. And every penny in new projects is put aside under a new single line. It's a new line in the budget called PPPs. Because every penny will go to get the private sector to deliver the basic infrastructure that we as a government must deliver. I have to get out of this business as a government of implementing my own projects. So we'll continue whatever we started, but the new projects will be PPPs. That will increase the efficiency of expenditure. That will create leverage from what we're actually spending, because you get 1 to 5x, 1 to 10x of what we're spending in PPPs, in actual deliverable capex. The challenge, obviously, is the economic situation is not easy. Unemployment is high. The economy is not growing as we all want it to be. That's the bad side. But there are a lot of positives I'm seeing. Tourism has been growing by really impressive numbers. Our current account has actually witnessed the biggest improvement in years. Our exports are up by a very good %. Our imports are down. To me, that's bad news because I'm collecting less from these imports, but to the economy, that's very healthy. I think, and I think this will be an important fact to mention. You mentioned the ease of doing business, and I fully agree with you, sir. That's why when last month when I was still at planning, I had the privilege of announcing that Jordan, in the most recent ease of doing business, has jumped by an unprecedented 29 ranks, the biggest jump in Jordan's history. Now we're ranking 74. We were above 100 before. And we're using that to increase the momentum to deliver more reform. Here's the challenge, everybody. All these reforms, structural, will take years to pay. We all know that. My biggest challenge in the immediate short run is confidence in the economy. And unless we all believe we can get out of this, we're not going to get out of this. Come to me, please. Advise me. I will make mistakes. But I want to hear from you about these mistakes. I will push in a different direction, and I will give you my word. Within a few months, we will change the whole tariff system of the customs. That will be my signal to you that we're trying to move things in a different direction. Support us, please, and let's have a new direction together. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Well, this is very encouraging indeed. Thank you very much, Dr. Mohammed. I'll come back to you on some of the issues that you've mentioned, but I want to move to... No. I'll come back on a few issues to sort of give you the support that you need. You said come back to me, so I'm following you. I'd like just to move because for even some of the issues that you've mentioned, you still need the institutional support. And for that, we also have the pleasure of having Dr. Yasir Aghosha, Jordanian Minister of State and for Institutional Performance Development. Formerly, she occupied the position of Minister of Public Sector Development, where she also previously served as a member of the Jordanian Senate, draws on her legal background and years of public office to reform the policies, directives, procedures, and mechanisms required for optimal institutional performance. My question to you, given that you are in charge of the institutional performance, Dr., what is lacking in terms of implementation? And do we have a vision on how government should pursue itself in the future? We have the notion of smart and efficient, simple and flat, and so let's support whatever reform we're talking by the institutions. So please, Dr.
أنا بدي أحكي بالعربي ممكن؟ برتاح أكثر يمكن. كل اللي حكاه الدكتور محمد أنا بقدره جدا. بس زي ما تفضلت إذا ما كان في مؤسسات حكومية تعمل معه بنفس الطريقة لا يمكن أن يتحقق شيء. يجب أن نعمل جميعا كلنا بنفس الطريقة. مشان هيك هيكلة الحكومة هي أولوية. من 20 سنة يمكن أنا بشتغل مع موضوع تطوير القطاع العام، ومن أولها كان موضوع إعادة هيكلة الدوائر انطرح. وبالاستراتيجية 2004 طبعا احنا عندنا استراتيجيات نفسها طلعت 2004 وكل سنتين ترد تنعاد، وكان فيها محور أساسي اسمه ترشيق الجهاز الحكومي. لكن حتى نستطيع كانت تنزاد ما يترشق، كانوا يزيدوها. لكن بال2011 أظن أخذوا قرار إنه لا لابد من صدر قرار بترشيق الجهاز الحكومي وإعادة النظر بالدوائر الحكومية. ما ينقصنا الصحيح إحنا إنه التنفيذ. بحطوا استراتيجيات، كل حكومة بتيجي بتبني استراتيجية جديدة. الحكومة يجب أن تبني على الحكومات السابقة وتتابع وتنفذ. إحنا ما بنعاني منه في الأردن هو إنه بنحط استراتيجية ما بنطبقها، بيجي وزراء جداد بيشطبوا الاستراتيجية وبنبدأ الاستراتيجية يعني وبالتالي ما في عنا تطبيق، ما في عنا متابعة، ما في عنا نعرف بالضبط شو اللي صار. هلا إحنا الحكومة هون اعتبروها أولوية، لأنه بخطاب التكليف حطها جلالة الملك أولوية التطوير الإداري وترشيق الجهاز الحكومي. الحكومة يجب أن تكون تقدم الخدمة بأفضل جهاز بأقل تكلفة وتحقق أفضل النتائج. هذه أفضل الممارسات في العالم وهذا ما نسعى له. درسوا كل الجهاز الحكومي، راجعوا هل هذا برنامج تنفيذي في وزارة، بيروح للوزارة هو رقابي بضل جهة مستقلة وفي دائما جهة بتراقبه. الاشي المهم بدنا نحكي عنه هو انه العالم كله هلا عم بيحكي على ترشيق الجهاز الحكومي. يعني روسيا رشقوا الجهاز وعملوهم 20 مؤسسة، بريطانيا عملوهم 18 وزارة. كل العالم عم بيحكي كيف تستطيع أن تقدم الخدمة بأرخص تكلفة وأفضل نتائج. بأكد أحكي لك كدكتور محمد، إذا في مجال للشراكة بين القطاع العام والخاص نستطيع إنه هاي الخدمات نحولها للقطاع العام والخاص، للقطاع الخاص ويستفيد منها القطاع العام. فإذا إحنا ما يجب أن ننظر له هل نحن بحاجة لهاي الخدمة أن تتم بهاي الطريقة من خلال الجهاز الحكومي أم يمكن إنه إحنا نعيد تنظيمها من خلال جهاز آخر. وبالتالي أهم شيء هو ما ننظر له هل هذه الحكومة نحن بحاجة لها بهذا العدد الكبير من الدوائر الحكومية. يعني عندنا قديش 70 مؤسسات مستقلة، في شيء منها لا يمكن أن تمسه، في شيء منه لابد من إعادة النظر فيه. يعني مثلا عندنا البنك المركزي، في دوائر لا يمكن أنك تمسها، لازم تضلها مستقلة، بس في دوائر ممكن تدخل ضمن دوائر تانية، وأصلا لما راجعناها أصلا هي كانت ضمن دوائر تانية. فإحنا هذا الهدف، هذا ما نعمل نسعى لتحقيقه، لكن يجب يكون في التزام مش بس للحكومة هاي، للحكومات المتعاقبة. مش إنه كل ما تيجي حكومة اللي تعمله تبدأ من أول، أو هي ما بتبدأ من أول، هي تعيد كتابة الاستراتيجية مرة ثانية.
Thank you, Dr. Yasir. I think even the issue of sustaining efforts to reform is as important as starting this. But as we are also discussing countries' experience in reform, like Georgia, we have with us also EY partner Adam Chepnik. He has helped lead EY's public sector restructuring practice, which specializes and where he specializes in advising government on financial and operational transformations, which I think it's that conduit that would link between what we're saying and how to execute and implement that. Mr. Adam has previously served as a U.S. Treasury official, where he played a key role in the development of the federal response to Puerto Rico financial crisis. Adam is a graduate of Harvard Business School and Harvard Kennedy School of Government, and he's a frequent speaker about solutions to resolve financial distress. Clearly, you have an experience on the issues that relate to restructuring and how to revisit the existing financial system. I hope we can listen and hear from you about your previous experience in some other countries. And also maybe we can elaborate at some point that we're also revisiting our financial system, centralized, decentralized, etc. The floor is yours. Please, Mr. Adam.
Thank you, and thank you for having me.
Just get closer to the mic, please.
There we go. Thank you, and thank you for having me. I thought what would be helpful to share with you all was the story of Puerto Rico, which is something I've been working on for a number of years now, and some of the exportable concepts that you may want to consider as this government continues its transformation into the future. Let me begin by just offering some context in the background of this situation. In Puerto Rico, their population continues to leave. It's an island off the coast of Florida in the Caribbean of the U.S. The citizens of Puerto Rico, there are more than 3 million of them, are U.S. citizens, and they continue to leave. Just a short while ago, the population was close to 3.8 million people. Today, it's close to 3 million people. More than 15% of the population has left the island because of the continued economic distress and shrinking economy and lack of jobs that are available. You can see that on the right, the GNP has continued to shrink for well over a decade. So rather than transform the government in the past, the government chose to take several steps. One was to borrow in the capital markets. So Puerto Rico's debt load went from around $26 billion in US terms in the year 2000 to around $72 billion today. Its debt to GDP ratio exceeded 100%. It was clearly unsustainable. The government also used its pension assets, a reserve for the retirement of its workers, and spent down those assets. So today there's a $55 billion pension liability and no money set aside for the retirement security of its workers. That's the historical construct of Puerto Rico's situation. And then 2 years ago, Hurricane Maria hit. This was a Category 5 storm, the highest, most devastating storm in the history of the island. It caused complete devastation. The power grid was decimated. Schools were damaged. Today, 2 years later, if you fly into San Juan, as I do several weeks a month, you can still see blue tarps over the homes of the residents who are still waiting for their roofs to be repaired. And so it's in that construct that the U.S. Congress stepped in and created and passed a law requiring the creation of a multi-year fiscal plan, a multi-year path to restoration of growth on the island, and a framework to restructure the financial obligations of the government. So let me share with you all just briefly the components of that plan and some lessons that I think can be exported here and considered going into the future. The plan has several elements to it, but the ones that I thought would be particularly of interest to this audience are, one, the improvement in the business environment. In Puerto Rico, they historically led with tax incentives. Every business and person was eligible for some different form of a credit and an amalgamation of incentives. So the government has already started to undertake a reform of its tax system to simplify the issuance of those credits and to simplify the way that the tax system operates. Permitting reform has been equally important. I think we heard earlier today, the need to go to multiple agencies to be able to open a business. It is exactly the same situation in Puerto Rico today, and so the government has undertaken an effort to try to simplify its permitting. And tax compliance has been another key initiative to try to take risk takers into being compliant tax filers through correspondence audits and the synchronization of various databases that the government owns. Now you can look at the power company, the water company, and various other databases to sync up and make sure that businesses and people are filing the appropriate amount of taxes. Government reform and transformation has some context in terms of the need to right-size the government to fit its people. But at the same time, in Puerto Rico, the government is spending an enormous amount of capital to reinvest in its public sector workforce. So the savings created by consolidating agencies, I heard 70 agencies here in Jordan. There's 114 agencies in Puerto Rico. Remember, 3 million people on the entire island. There are more people that live in Amman than on the entire island of Puerto Rico, and more agencies there. So the consolidation of those efforts is critically important. The improvement of healthcare has been important as well. And finally, transparency, the enhancement of transparency and the modernization of the infrastructure have been essential to the island's restoration of growth. On the transparency front, several things have happened. Historically, the budget in Puerto Rico for agencies consisted of 2 lines per agency: payroll and operating expenses. That was the amount of visibility and transparency the residents had on their tax dollars that were spent. The government has undertaken a transformation, so now there are dozens of lines for each budget, for each agency, so that the people of Puerto Rico can see how their money is being spent and can give feedback on the priorities that the government has. In addition, the budget was historically the general fund budget of the island. But there's as much spending that takes place through special revenue funds and alternate dedicated sources of revenue that never had transparency until the recent budgets today. And finally, on the infrastructure front, the government is undertaking a massive transformation to invest in public-private partnerships, looking at is setting up an independent energy regulator and trying to take steps to be able to manage this transformation process. So what are some lessons that I think are helpful for you to walk away with? The first is those who cannot pay will not pay. Having a sustainable debt level and interest cost is essential. The first thing that the government will stop doing is funding its CapEx, so it's very good to hear that there's a focus on investing in the capital infrastructure of the economy of Jordan. The second thing people will stop funding is pensions, and the final thing is businesses and vendors. So having a sustainable debt level is critical to be able to make those long-term investments. Second, you must have a long-term fiscal plan, and that must reflect your vision. A multi-year plan is essential, but it also has to be tied to your budgets. So having a plan that sits on paper is of no use to anybody. The longest list does not win. You have to have tailored, focused, multi-year transformation plans that are tied to your annual budgets. You also need to assess the capacity for implementation. We spend a lot of time in San Juan working with the government to try to assess the capacity for implementing the reforms. It's not just the political will of reform, but it's also the practical ability to make those transformations. Inertia in government is extraordinarily palpable. And so you need to be able to cut through that to make the transformation. And finally, on the transparency front and accountability and in that element of this, we started publishing monthly reports. Previously, the government did not know how many people showed up for work. So we started publishing attendance reports. Previously, the government had no visibility on what the gross revenues were. All revenues of the government were funded on a net basis. So the government has now published a tax transparency report so that people on the island can see where all of their money is going, how many credits are being issued and offered to businesses and people, and whether that makes political sense or they want to reform and eliminate some of those credits. And finally, there are a number of public forums and opportunities for the public to be able to interact with the government and help be a part of this transformation. So I hope some of those elements are applicable here and can be exported, and I'm happy to elaborate on them if given the opportunity.
Thank you, Adam, and definitely these 3-4 elements that you've mentioned about how to realize the vision, the transparency, also the engagement is, although it's sort of basics, but we need to continue emphasizing this. I want to move on to, for all what we're doing, and even the PPP project that Dr. Muhammad has mentioned, you need the financial support. For that, we're having the Ms. Salma Rasavik from the International Financial Corporation, Senior Private Sector Specialist. She is senior professional with close to 15 years of private sector development experience in developing countries, primarily in Europe and Central Asia, Middle East, Africa, and Asian Pacific region. More specifically, she has an extensive IFC country office management and project management experience in different regions, and currently leading IFC engagement in MENA region, which focuses on private sector solutions in the context of force displacements in particular. Ms. Selma, as an international organization that known to support and extend support for basically private sector project in a unique product that you do, normally how do you perceive and handle the issue of public sector reform, and where you see your contributions in sort of promoting also the kind of project that would help take us in that direction?
Just to check whether you can hear me, if the audio is working well. First of all,
please.
yeah. Is this better? Yeah. Thank you very much. First of all, I wanted to thank EY for the organization of this very important event, for inviting us to be a part of this, first of all, esteemed panel, and thank you all for coming for today's event. I thought it would be important to share just a few remarks for you to get a sense what IFC does on the government-facing technical assistance side in terms of providing the advisory support to our client governments. So our team is part of what we call a joint World Bank IFC global practice called Finance Competitiveness and Innovation, which essentially combines our global experience and expertise both in financial sector but also private sector to really support the client governments to reach and further strengthen their efforts in private sector-led growth for their respective countries and help create markets. So due to the jointness of the global practice, we are able to design, I would say, tailored, I emphasize the importance of tailored and comprehensive solutions both on the financial and the private sector side, and leverage a range of instruments on the World Bank side, whether it be loans or guarantees, or the IFC technical assistance sides, which is very much focused on hands-on technical assistance to our government counterparts. So we are a team of about 700 people globally. We're present in all the regions around the world, and I would say that our key areas of focus are really focused on 6 global themes, which we then leverage the relevant global and country expertise to help implement on the ground reform projects, which are guided very much, and I emphasize the importance of this, on the client demand and capacity to implement. So just to briefly take you through these 6 global themes for you to get a sense of the breadth and scope of our engagement, and then I will put that in the context of Jordan. So on the financial sector side, when it comes to government-facing technical assistance in this global practice, we are very much involved in the supporting the clients to ensure that their financial systems are both sound and transparent, that the market infrastructure is strengthened so the households and both firms have access to financial services. We also work very much on business enabling environment related reforms, which when addressed help create a more conducive environment for businesses to thrive and to grow. We're also very much involved in the sector regulatory reforms, whether even on the sector or even a specific value chain. A level that we look into the constraints at sector or value chain level that if addressed have the potential to really unlock that particular sector or that even value chain for more private sector investments. And then on the long-term financing, we're also involved in facilitating long-term finance through capital markets. And last but not least, we help clients design financial solutions to help build their resilience to both climate risks and shocks. Now, in the context of Jordan, I wanted to start by saying that our work specifically in the country is very much aligned and guided by the 5-year growth matrix and vision for Jordan, which combines a series of horizontal and vertical reforms that the government is prioritizing going forward for the country. So in that context, in Jordan, we are very much involved in the business enabling environment related reforms, improving the competitiveness and export of Jordanian products and strengthening the financial regulatory frameworks. And His Excellency mentioned already the Doing Business report, and I wanted to really use the opportunity to both congratulate Jordan for making such improvement, such strides and effective improvements in the overall business environment for the country, and I think it was 29 positions that the country has. The rank is 75 for this year, which was a jump of 29 positions from only last year. So I think this is important to recognize this achievement and really build on this reform momentum that has been created, and we as IFC stand ready to support the government of Jordan going forward on further implementation of reforms in this context. So just to specifically give you a sense of the types of projects that we are involved in at the moment with our respective government counterparts, and they come as no surprise given the 5-year matrix is very much aligned around furthering the business enabling environment reform to create a further more conducive environment for the private sector here in Jordan to grow and thrive. I will, in terms of the lessons, because a number of the panelists have mentioned some of the lessons that I wanted to also bring to the discussion. So maybe I will focus on those that were not specifically mentioned, that we bring sort of from engaging on these types of reform projects, both in the region and also globally. I think our colleague from EY mentioned the capacity to implement reform. I think this is something that is becoming exceptionally important consideration for us when we're designing and having a discussion with our government counterparts on a particular reform, because it's not sufficient, obviously, to pass a certain law, certain bylaw. It's critically important that we build the capacity of the relevant counterparts and agencies involved in the reform process to really sustain the implementation effort. So that capacity to implement for us is something that we bring as a lesson learned and experience both globally and regionally. Something else that's sort of external, I would say, to our specific projects, but it's a very important consideration also, and in the context of Jordan, there are a lot of donors involved in providing support on a number of areas or reform implementation processes. So it's quite important that there's an effort to leverage and synergize among the different initiatives to really ensure that the efforts of the broader donor community are targeted, that we are able to leverage off of each other's both resources and experience, all in the effort to reach the objective of a particular project. So this lesson of leveraging is something that I wanted to also mention that was not mentioned by my other esteemed colleagues on the panel. So maybe I will leave it here and open to questions. Yeah.
Thank you. And while it's highly appreciated, you've mentioned the capacity to undertake reform. Our Minister of Finance is going to announce the budget today at 12. So you can imagine that while he's talking to us, he's thinking elsewhere. So he had to leave in like 5 to 10 minutes. So, بعد إذنك دكتور, I would like just before Dr. Muhammad to leave, just to ask him second questions, and then we can let him go and hopefully wish him good luck in the next round of press conference. Recently, the government has announced its first and second incentives package. In the first package, you've mentioned something that I personally, I think a lot of the people in the room admire and appreciate, that there is a kind of stability pact incorporated in the incentive package, which guarantees like stability for like 10 years in regarding policies and regarding some of the incentive that exist already in the system. That is very good news for the private sector. I really want to push Dr. Muhammad to elaborate more on this, because even within that package, there was some sort of short-term incentives within that package. So how can we square this? If it is a pact or mithaq for 10 years, just elaborate a little bit on, because this is very conducive to growth. Before you go, Dr. Muhammad.
Thank you, Doctor, for raising this. This is case in point of what I was trying to convey before, that stability of policy is one of the biggest impediments to the private sector in Jordan. And that's why, as a government, when we were discussing these, we thought the first signal we need to send to the private sector is we will stabilize policy. Of course, this is challenging when you're doing a lot of reforms to improve ease of doing business. You're changing a lot of different issues. So I think the way to tackle it is, if it's a positive reform for the private sector, you can benefit from it if you choose to exercise that. If it's a negative reform, then it has to be grandfathered till after your feasibility work upon which you've established your business has been really fulfilled. And many of you know that that has been the biggest challenge. A lot of that came from talking directly to many people in this room and beyond in the private sector. I'll give you an example. Within a week of being cursed by being a Minister of Finance, I was asked to meet with a group of you know, the car traders, تجار السيارات, in free zones. And really, when I looked at the numbers, it made sense. I want the private sector to do well. I want transactions to happen because I will, as a government, make more revenue. So we spent literally 5 hours negotiating in very straight conversation. And within 12 hours of that, the decision was made. And I hope that's really a signal of our ability to converse. If you come to me with a case that shows very clearly that a reform will be good for you and good for revenues, that's all you need to prove to me. I'll take it forward. And really, this is a key issue in us moving forward. Another key issue about stability. It could have been very easy for me or for the government to fudge numbers on the revenues and overestimating them, underestimating expenditure. But that will only lead us to negative surprises few months into the year, which will then lead us to ad hoc taxation, etc., etc. And the number one fundamental principle we built this budget on, and this is what I said straight on to the IMF when they were in town 2 weeks ago. We will not increase taxes next year. We're done with increasing taxation. We have to improve collection. We have to fight tax evasion, but we're done passing our inability to square the budget on the average citizen and the private sector. And in order to do that, we had to take some tough decisions, but I protected every penny, and the government asked me to protect every penny of the PPPs. We did not take the shortcuts. Now here is an issue you all suffer from. I was having some conversations with some of you in the morning. There are a lot of arrears, متأخرات, running around in the economy because frankly we overestimated revenues and underestimated expenditure. So I want to make sure to resolve that. And we resolve that through 2 ways. Number one, I have to stop the flow of arrears. And we do that by being pragmatic about the expenditures we expect and the revenues we're going to collect. And let's not start a new project which I cannot finish. Let's finish the existing project. So this year, we made sure to allocate the entire budget that completing the desert road needs to have in order to complete it. Because frankly, it is unacceptable for the government that the life of Jordanians continues to be risked on this road. So inshallah, السنة الجاي الموازنة اللي لازمته مرصودة. Let's finish that. Let's finish existing projects. And the second thing is we need to deal with the stock of arrears that we've created. And hiding behind these arrears and acting as if they're not there is not right fiscal policy. I pay interest on them as Minister of Finance. They suck liquidity out of the market. And the next time we bid a project, the private sector takes into consideration that they will not be paid for a few years, so they raise the price. So this is not a healthy practice. And we want to end it once and for all, inshallah. It's these kinds of few steps that I think build the stability and the trust between the private sector and the government. Again, the world tomorrow will not be very different from today. But if we believe we're listening to each other and we're working together to the same end, and if you come to me when I screw up and when I come to you when you evade taxation, then we'll have a healthy balance of relationship between both of us. And maybe, just maybe, that will just increase sentiment and confidence in the economy a little bit, which will really have a big ramification for next year. If we end next year with stabilizing that and starting to build bit by bit confidence, inshallah baladna bkhair. Forgive me for having to leave, Doctor. Sorry.
Well, thanks again for His Excellency Dr. Asas, and we wish him good luck. I'll move to my final panelist, Dr. Muhammad Al-Khasawne. He's a senior partner in EY MENA, an expert in government and public sector with specialization in public sector transformation and public finance management. He comes in with more than 15 years of experience in helping government embrace leading practices in overall public administration, public sector transformation, public financial management and governance as a key enabler to sustainable economic growth and development. Dr. Khasawne has his PhD in economics from the USA. I think it's good that we have the second question for Dr. Muhammad, because that is about how shall government approach basically the reform. What are the pillars, tools that define the scope, steps, and priorities for reform, as well as the outcome of the reform process, Doctor?
Thank you, Doctor. And I would like, before we start, just to thank our colleagues and partners from EY for hosting this event, as well as the sponsors and everyone else who came in today. This is a very important topic. I don't think it's been in the past discussed enough. To be honest, we always talk about economic growth, we talk about even political reform, but we don't talk about institutional reform. And it is really something that is key, and it's very important. And definitely wish the Minister of Finance best of luck in the budget, because without money, at least one of the elements, you cannot do anything. So without you can't really, if you can't afford it, then you should not be able to go around and do this. Now, many of the panelists today, they've spoken about some elements of the framework. And what is important here, in my view, is to work within a framework. You cannot work within bits and pieces. And there are many elements. And I'm just going to mention some of those, in passing, and maybe hopefully we'll get a chance to discuss it even further and in more details. The first one is about the vision. And this is the questions that you, Doctor, I think you started as well, is what is the vision of the reform? What is it that we want to do? Where do we want to be? Typically, there are two types of reforms. The traditional one, I call it the traditional one, which is some of the examples that Dr. Al-SS and His Excellency, the ex-Prime Minister of Georgia, mentioned, which is around tax transformation, business process streamlining, digitization. These are very important, but these are traditional reforms that we all do in terms of improving the efficiency and the operationalization of the government. The second one, which is more difficult, and I think is probably what Jordan needs, is to ask a hard question, is do we need to continue to spend money on government reforms? It's very expensive, very costly, and there are so many evidence that says that government reforms in general really fail. Probably 80% of government reforms globally fail. So why do we keep spending money on government reforms? Why don't we ask a more fundamental question around what is the role of government that we want going forward in the economy? Part of it is number of ministries and number of entities that we have, merging them. But the bigger picture, or the more fundamental question, is how much of our GDP we want the government to actually produce. I think we always talk about government reforms, and if you look at some of the literature and some of our professors who taught us policy making and transformation, they will tell you that governments itself doesn't have the mechanism to actually reform itself. They don't really have the mechanisms to even recognize that they have made a mistake or they correct a mistake. Usually when they make a mistake, what do? They grow even bigger. They create other entities and other organizations and other committees, unlike the private sector. So it's very important to, before we even embark on talking about reform, is to ask ourselves fundamentally, what is the role of the government in the economy going forward? My view and the notion that I really support, less is better. I wish, and I think this is the trend going forward, maybe regionally and globally. We will see within maybe 5 to 10, 15 years that governments, in terms of producing services and in terms of is going to be very, very, very minimal. And this is where we should really go and we should do. In any way, but this is just an element, and we can discuss this, and this needs a lot of debate, of course, and there's a lot of pros and cons and supporters and opponents to that. But the first one that we need to understand in this, and I just emphasize this in the framework, is really the vision. What is the vision of the reform? This is very important that we need to do and we need to have. The second element is continuity and measurability. So any reform that we decide and agree on, it has to continue. It cannot start and stop with a minister or a prime minister or a government. It has to continue. So we need to have certain checks and balances, and hopefully we can discuss this maybe if we get a chance, is how we can do this. You cannot now today, and after a month or after a year or after 2 years, when this government is gone, we start all over again. It's a disaster, and this is what we've been doing over the past 10 to 15 years. Measurability is very important. His Excellency, the Prime Minister mentioned about KPIs, and it is really very important, but we need to set the right KPIs at the right level and measure them and drive that performance as a private sector. This is very key. Third element, leadership, commitment, and sponsorship. And we do have this in Jordan. You know, His Majesty the King always talks about this one, and I believe that we do have, and you governments have, that level of sponsorship and commitment to do whatever it really takes. A lot of reforms, especially the difficult ones, are not popular. So thus they need sponsorship, they need the leadership to sponsor them and to commit to continue and to help the people who will be doing this. A lot of ministers and a lot of government officials probably will fall as shuhada, as martyrs, while they are doing this, because they will lose their popularity and they will be doing things that are against the public opinion. They need to have the right protection and the right commitment from the leadership to make sure that they are covered while they are doing the right thing. Resources, very important, financial resources and also human resources. Always many of the reforms that fail, and we will probably take a look at some of the surveys that EY and other research companies have done in the past. You will see that a lot of the failure in the reform comes because of the implementation. We plan, but we fail to implement because we don't have capacity. And I think this is a challenge, but it's an opportunity, and we'll talk about this one, because you can outsource some of these things. You can actually bring in the private sector, and you create jobs, and you create some sort of in that as well. And that is an example that His Excellency mentioned in customs in Georgia and other also countries as well. Transparency is very important. You have to put your money where your mouth is. You cannot say, I'm going to transform, and then you find out that there are some issues here and there, and corruption and what have you. So this is a very important element that you need to embed in the framework and watch out for. Flexibility. You have to be flexible. You have to reform the reform. You have to continue. You have to adopt. You have to have a feedback. You will not get it right the first time, so you have to accept that. It's not a one-way, it's a two-way street. Last thing is think about implementation and sustainability. You cannot just initiate the reform without thinking how you're going to implement it and how you're going to sustain it. Each one of those, you can probably talk about it for a day, but these are some of the elements that I see that needs to exist within a framework for a reform to stick and to show results.
Well, thank you very much, Muhammad. You've mentioned something that's quite interesting, and I think the former Prime Minister has alluded to, which is that the government does not have mechanism from within to do that reform, so it looks. But let me, in my introduction, when we talk about small or large government, I want to emphasize, and I just want to share this piece of information, that government and public sector spending globally has been on a general upward trajectory. And it was 30% in the 60s, it's in the range of 40-45% now. So it's only growing. So it's there, so we have to deal with that. We really have to deal with that and how that is going to operate. But before I go back to Her Excellency Yasra, I want to get your thoughts. You see, we have good intentions in Jordan. We have good sort of energy as well to undertake reform. You talk about deep reform, but what we're hearing here is more of a piecemeal in a way reform. So your reflections on what you have heard so far, Prime Minister.
Can you hear me? Yeah. First of all, I would like to reflect on your statements about big and small government and how big the size of the government should be in a country. And I think it's a very, very important point. And by the way, when I was writing a book, my book about practical economics, I actually had to do the research of the worldwide successful countries who had a very high growth. What was their government expenditure to GDP? You are right. Currently, European countries, they spend like 40%, maybe even higher of GDP. But none of them had that high when they were growing. The growth of high growth hasn't come to any country in the past 50 years who had budget to GDP of above 40%. Do you know that? None of them. There is not one single example of a country who quadrupled or doubled GDP in a short period of time who had a high budget to GDP. When they reached 20,000 GDP per capita, they already could afford to have 35, 40, 45% budget to GDP. They turned into social country. But before you reach 20, 25, 30, $40,000 of GDP per capita, it's impossible to achieve high growth with that kind of budget to GDP. So you need to decide, what do you want? Do you want fast growth, or do you want very slow growth, but with some high expenditures of the government? What I have discovered during my research, there are only 18 countries who've managed to have fast growth. What do I mean by fast growth? Growth of any one decade, starting from 1980 till now. Why 1980? Because IMF has a database of 1980 till now, which is open. Any 10 years, when government reached average growth rate of 7% or more, where GDP per capita in nominal terms was quadrupled and in PPP terms was doubled. There are only 18 countries who did that, and these are like Singapore, South Korea, Ireland, Thailand, Asian countries, few European countries, Eastern European countries, couple of them, Georgia, by the way, one of them. None of them had, during that period, none of them had anywhere close to 30% budget to GDP. All of them were around 20, 25%, leaving more money in the economy for private sector and managing efficiently the government expenditure. I believe that IMF's concept of budget deficit, that the budget deficit is the most important parameter, is wrong. I believe that IMF's concept of austerity is wrong. It does not help. I believe that whatever in practice what we did in Georgia, and that was in 2008, 2009 during financial crisis, and in parallel with Russian invasion, we did the following. We actually increased the budget deficit, but with that we increased investment part of the budget. Of course, we decreased operational part of the budget, but we hugely increased investment part of the budget, and I believe that budget deficit should not be the only criteria for fiscal healthiness of a country. It should be budget deficit plus investment to the budget, government investment to the budget, plus budget to GDP. This is like I call it budget optimum, triad, which should be taken in consideration instead of having a focused on budget deficit only.
Shouldn't be a limit for that level of budget deficit, Prime Minister?
No, I don't believe there should be limit in case of downturn. In case of upturn, definitely. But in case of downturn, we ourselves in Georgia, we had a budget deficit of 9% for 2 years, and we decreased it back to 3% easily. Why? Because we didn't use this budget deficit money for pensions and salaries. Because once you use that for pensions and salaries, you cannot decrease it. Yeah. It's impossible. Politically, it's impossible. We used that for investment projects, for 2-year, 3-year investment projects, and then went back. But by that, we poured in money into the private sector. We gave confidence to private sector, which is very, very important moment during crisis, during economic downturn, or during a slow growth, to give private sector stimulus, to give private sector message that don't worry, we know what we are doing, just like Minister of Finance said, and there is more money coming into the country. And I think this is very important. And just one last point about there were some statements here that we want to do reforms, but I mean there needs to be sponsorship, and there needs to be. I believe managing expectations is the key to successful reform. I don't believe that you can find almost any reform which will be accepted by everybody. Any reform will have some kind of opposition. But managing the expectations of all key stakeholders is a must. By what I mean by managing expectations is explaining to public, explaining to that private sector who will be affected by this, and explaining to bureaucracy, and explaining to higher level decision makers, for me it was president, for example, what and when should we expect after this reform, and delivering on that. And once you've managed a couple of times this kind of delivery, you get more credit. And you can use this more credit for more unpopular reforms. Of course, you cannot use all the credit for unpopular reforms. Sometimes you need to do something popular, but it needs to be a mix. But in my experience, managing expectations was the key to successful transformation and key to successful reforms. I believe what I'm hearing right now, everybody really wants to go ahead with the reforms. The problem is most likely with implementation, and it is problem in many, many countries. Why we are so good with implementation? Because Georgia was lucky enough to hit the rock bottom. We couldn't go anywhere else. We were bankrupt, so we had to implement. And that's why our experience may be not a very good example for many countries who are doing quite well. And you don't have to do these reforms. We actually, there was no other way in our case. And that's why we actually had to implement. In the case of Jordan, yes, the problem, not only Jordan, most of the countries that I've visited and I've advised like 25 different governments in the past 5-6 years, this is the problem. Implementation is the problem, and not continuity of reforms is the problem. Once the reform blows back, and most of the reforms, by the way, will have some problems, governments get scared and they try to forget about this reform and try to come up with something new. Governments are very good in coming up with the plans. And I don't want to name the governments which I'm advising, and I'm advising. They come up with one plan. The moment the time came for implementation, they started to drawing the plan number 2. I will not name the country.
You have to have plan
no.
A, plan B, plan C.
And then plan 2 was drafted. Plan 2 was drafted by all the consultants, everybody. Plan 2 was drafted, and now time is coming up to start the Plan 2. Nobody's going to do implementation still. Now I'm waiting that I will be called to draft the Plan 3. Most likely this will be the case. So governments are amazing in drafting the plans. The moment government is starting implementation, this is where problem starts. And why? Because ministers think, if something goes wrong, I'm going to get fired. If I don't do anything, and everything goes like that smoothly, most likely I will stay. And I think this is the problematic approach of all the governments, of most of the governments. And you need to find, out of the formula of these 4 which I mentioned, you need to find what makes your ministers, what makes your bureaucrats, what makes your civil society tick out of these 4 motivators, and they need to take decisions during implementation. Not during planning, but during implementation. This is the most difficult process. But once successful They will enjoy it so much, they will not stop.
Thank you. Well, probably this is like, this crisis-driven approach versus the gradual approach, which I can tell you the deepest reform we took in Jordan was somehow crisis-driven back in 1989. Anyway, but that's a different story. But Dr. Yasser, you seem to have agreed with some of the things. My question is regarding also what also Dr. Muhammad has alluded to in terms of that capacity to implement, and another element, which is that gap between the top-ranking bureaucrats that seems to agree with what we are saying, and the ones that should take these measures on the ground. So how we're bridging that, and what we do in terms of capacity building for that matter.
اللي حكاه أول شيء الدكتور محمد يعني هو الحكي يعني آمن فيه بشكل كبير. إذا ما كان في خطط، أوكي بيعملوا خطط، كل الحكومة كل خطة ممتازة. بدك تطبق ويكون ناس بتراقب، ويمكن معالي مروان جمعة بطلع علي أنه عارف عن إيش بحكي، اللي هي دائرة المتابعة مع مؤشرات أداء وتاريخ، وكل وزير مسؤول أمام، لأنه التطوير الإداري هي مسؤولية أفقية على كل الحكومة، ومسؤول عن متابعتها رئيس الوزراء، وهذه هي الطريقة الصحيحة. يعني مشان ينعرف مين المسؤول ونفذ ولا ما نفذ وتاريخ التنفيذ. فهاي كتير مهمة. فيعني اللي حكاه هو الاشي بنشتغل عليه. من تجربتي برضه كنا نشوف انه الحكومة تشتغل هذا لحاله وهذا بيشتغل لحاله وما بيحكوا مع بعض.
كيف نخليهم يحكوا مع بعض؟
لأن هذا
أصلا
لا أقول لك كيف نخليهم يحكوا مع بعض. لابد من إنه هاي من خلال دائرة متابعة الأداء بتبين إنه المشروع هذا واقف، بدك تحكي معه تقول له ليش واقف؟ بقول وزير الفلان ما اشتغل معنا. هلا مثلا على سبيل المثال في إشي اللي هو أعلن عنه دولة الرئيس، بده يعمل رياض أطفال بالمملكة 2020. طلع 20 مؤسسة في الأردن يجب أن توافق على تأسيس هاي رياض الأطفال. كيف بدها 20 مؤسسة؟ وطبعا كل واحد بيعتبر الرخصة ملكه، ما حيقبل يتنازل عنها لحدا. فإحنا جبناهم قعدناهم على الطاولة وشفنا إيش في إشي لازم يندمج مع حدا تاني ونشتغل عليه. فهاي نقطة أنا يعني كتير مبسوطة لازم ينشغل عليها ويبين، يقعدوا مع بعض ويحكوا. بس بالنسبة للموظفين الحكومة، أنا بعتقد الإدارة الحكومية مش الوزير بس، الوزير عنده رؤية ومنصب سياسي مهم، لكن الأمين العام والمدراء كتير مهمين. لكن اللي بنشوفه عنا أول إشي بيعمله الوزير أول ما يوصل يا بيجمد الأمين العام يا بيشيله، والمدراء بيغيرهم. طب ما في استمرارية بتصير بالمؤسسة. لازم يكون في إدارة للمؤسسة لسنوات، للقطاع لسنوات. مش
عليكي، ما احنا هذا اللي يعني what to do about this.
احنا عم نشتغل عليه هذا الحكي، اوكي؟ هذا مفروض من الاشياء اللي انا التزمت فيها اني بدي اشتغل عليها مع ديوان الخدمة المدنية ومع هذه الإدارة. لازم يعملوا برامج، وهذا بده يصير طريقة يعني اللي عم بشتغل عليه مع ديوان الخدمة المدنية، يكون في آلية لتقييم الموظف. يمكن إذا هون في أكثر من واحد وزير بيعرف إنه موظفين الحكومة كلهم تقديرهم ممتاز.
ما فيش carrot and sticks. One of the fair pillars of reform was carrot and sticks. واضح إنه مش موجود. نظام الخدمة المدنية بعيقها.
هلا بده إعادة، هلا عم بيشتغلوا إعادة تنظيمه، صياغته، وأحدها هو إنه ربط ممكن نشتغل إنه في مكافآت وفي وما إلى ذلك، لكن من خلال تقييم الأداء. وهو هذا أهم شيء. زي ما بدك تقيم أداء المؤسسات ماذا أنجزت، بدك تشوف الموظف الحكومي، لأنه إحنا أنت بتعرف موظف الحكومة كلياتهم ممتاز وجيد جدا، ممتاز وجيد جدا. ليش بالقطاع الخاص في طريقة لتقييم الموظفين؟ لأنه بيعرف بالقطاع الخاص إذا ما تقيم بالطريقة الصحيحة ينهى عقده، بينما بالقطاع العام ما في. فإحنا لابد من وجود طريقة، وهي اللي عم نشتغل عليها مع ديوان الخدمة إحنا، لوضع طريقة تقييم موضوعية حقيقية. إن شاء الله نقدر.
إن شاء الله. Mr. Adam, I want to get back. We still have like 10 minutes to go, so bear with us. You talked about this program that you shared with us, but in terms of priorities, in terms of where to start, because again, you have to start from sort of key areas where you can leverage and you can have influence elsewhere. Where would you start? What are the messages for policymakers in terms of key priorities, key issues that they need to start with?
I think there are two key messages. One is capacity building. So you talk about right-sizing government, having government that is a percentage of the overall economy, but if that involves moving your workforce from the public sector, you have to have opportunities in the private sector. So the long-term structural reforms are critical, creating an environment for job creation. And the other piece is just practical. So, procurement reform. Governments in distress have fractured procurement. Centralizing procurement, centralizing the treasury management functions, centralizing contracting, making it easier to do business are some of the elements. And I think the last thing I'll leave you with is something I haven't heard anyone talk about, but we are in the middle of a new industrial revolution through the application of technologies and energy reform. The deployment of blockchain technologies, the cost of production of alternative energy, solar, has dropped precipitously. It is now cheaper, it is either equivalent or cheaper in different places around the world to produce solar power than it is under coal. In fact, the Kentucky Coal Museum in the U.S. is powered by solar right now. So, the application of these new technologies, innovation in government, and creating the capacity for these structural reforms is really where, if you focus on them, you can make massive transformative change.
Thank you. Well, before I get to give you just 1 minute for a closing remark, we'd like to ask our audience if they have any question that you'd like to direct to. Just raise your hand, and I assume there is a mic. I can see someone in the back. I'll come you to Zaidun, please. Just introduce yourself, please.
Hi, I'm Rashad Shawa. Thank you, Mr. Saif, Mr. Barqawi, and the organizers, and of course, Mr. Gilari, for being here. Actually, I've been following George's case for some time and read your book. And I'd just like to make a short note, followed by possibly some comments from the panel. Regarding the issue of the shadow economy, which was not really, maybe you didn't manage to focus much during your talk on that. There was one policy, which was the lottery on cash receipts, that I found very striking, as it turns the entire population into enforcement officers and surveillance for VAT compliance and for compliance in general. So if you can just talk a little bit about that and maybe open the floor for the panelists on that point in particular.
Take a few questions and I'll come to you. Yeah. Okay.
Thank you.
Tariq? So there's a question here, please. We'll take 3 questions or 4 before we get to back here. I can see this side.
Yeah, thank you for this, informative sessions. And I would like just to stress the mere fact that Jordan is not just about, having Riyad al-Atfal. I mean, if you check the infrastructure that's going on for the past 5 years, since the introduction of EVs and the fall of prices for solar panels, you would find that major companies are doing wheeling projects here in Jordan, and they are benefiting, like these hotels, 5-star hotels, as I said. However, the average factory is not. Second, if you look at the infrastructure for EVs in Jordan, although the number of EVs here in Jordan from 20 to 30,000, we are still talking about 20 or less from 3 years. Last year it's still 20. This year it's 20. Next year it's going to be 20. I can assure you that next time we are going to meet, it's going to be 20. So what's happening that the government keeps saying, okay, we want to support this, we want to support that. However, on the ground, we are just faced with duties on EVs, and even though there are agreements that We shouldn't be paying for that. This will alleviate a lot of our problems on the budget, etc., etc. Nobody's taking any real action in this regard. No infrastructure whatsoever to stop the buses from emitting all these, high, cancerous and materials. So, what are we doing? This year is not going to be any different from next year, I think, in this transportation sector and energy sector. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Tariq, please, first row. Ya Shab. You have to go.
مع الرئيس وحكى معي سامي.
خلاص, you want to leave?
It seems that we're losing the last member of the government on the panel, so two things. First of all, I'd like to thank E&Y for giving us the privilege of sponsoring this event. Out of all the events that we sponsored as Egyptian Arab Land Bank, I see the highest return on our investment. So thank you, NY, for the great event, and I'd like to thank you, Doctor, and the panelists. I have a question for His Excellency, the Prime Minister. It's a bit self-serving. I'm a banker, so I have to ask about the role that the Georgian banking sector played, and what sort of reform did you implement in the banking sector, and how did the banks and the banking sector support and empower the reform process? Again, since we lost Her Excellency after we lost His Excellency, the Minister, the question I had, or the comment I had about the PPPs may go unheard, but one of the biggest problems we have with the PPP structures in Jordan is that Jordan has lost a lot of its credibility in terms of the international investors or even the local investors, because there are a lot of PPP initiatives that started and died before implementation, after the developers and the investors put a lot of money into the development process. This credibility that was lost is going to prove difficult to rebuild. The consistency and the credibility of policy is very important in this issue, just as important in other issues as well. Unfortunately, there's no one from the government, as usual, to hear what we say about this. So I'll leave that to whoever can relay it to them.
Thank you. Let me get Zidon and Valentina. I'll get the whole questions. Please, Zidon, and then we'll come back for a final round.
أول شيء صباح الخير جميعا، وشكرا للسادة إرنست أند يونغ لتنظيم هذا الاجتماع وهي الندوة. كنت أتمنى وجود عطوفة رئيس ديوان الخدمة المدنية السيد سامح الناصر، لأنه الموضوع كتير مهم، يعني تطوير القطاع العام، وديوان الخدمة المدنية هو عصب تطوير القطاع العام مفروض. بس أنا اللي بستغربه إنه كيف بدنا يعني نتوقع أي تطور بالقطاع العام إذا كان القطاع العام في الأردن بيشتغل 35 ساعة في الأسبوع، والقطاع الخاص بيشتغل 48 ساعة بالأسبوع استنادا لقانون وزارة العمل. احنا بنحكي عن 13 ساعة بالأسبوع فرق، يعني 2.5 ساعات في اليوم، يعني 2.5 ساعات، يعني اللي بيخلص على 3.5 بالدوائر الحكومية بالقطاع الخاص بيخلص على 6. فالانسنتيف واضح انه طبيعة الناس وين بدها تروح تشتغل، يعني حتى بالقطاع الخاص راح يوقف على الدور بالديوان الخدمة المدنية مشان يصح له يروح على القطاع العام، لانه بنقص ساعات العمل 2.5 و3، وغير البنفتس الهيلث بنفتس زي اللايف انشورنس وغيره. فيعني بستغرب انا، يعني احنا شايفين هالارضية وهالكلتشر و nobody is thinking or seeing this، ولا انا لحالي اللي شايفها ولا ما بعرف. ولسه الناس واقفة بالمئات الالاف على ديوان الخدمة المدنية بدهم يفوتوا القطاع العام ويهربوا من القطاع الخاص. لازم يصير في نوع من البالانس بين ساعات العمل بين القطاع العام والقطاع الخاص. إذا دقيقة، إذا ما صار هيك، ما طلعنا على these important things وضلينا ننظر ونحكي, I think it will be worthless. Thank you.
Thank you, Zidane. It's me. Okay, I'll get back to Valentina here. Yes, please.
My question is to His Excellency Mr. Gilari. You were a Prime Minister from 2009 to 2012, right? You did all of this in 3 years or 4 years?
9 years in total.
So the
9
reform
years
started.
in total.
Okay, so it started from you before being a Prime Minister. And how is it continuing? Yani? How is it still sustainable, the reform that you have done after 2012? Thank you.
Thank you. Salim. بعدين سامر. في حد تاني؟
Public sector reform is by definition not very popular amongst those that will be reformed. It requires will and it requires a mandate. Our political system is not purely democratic. We don't elect prime ministers. They come parachuting down and take over. And every step of the reform is opposed in the street by people saying no and no and no, and then you have to please the people. Can public sector reform take place without political reform in Jordan? I don't know who's going to answer this question. Perhaps Dr. Saif would.
Let's get here, please. This is the final question, and then we'll come back to the panels. You have one? Okay. Please.
Thank you very much, Sam al-Juda. Just 3 very quick points. Your Excellency talked about corruption in Georgia, and I commend you for the transparency. One point I'd like to add to that is administrative corruption, where no money is exchanging hands, but government bureaucrats or civil servants take their time in doing their job or in responding to investments or investors' questions or investments or permitting or whatever. And that, in my view, maybe people call it bureaucracy, I call it administrative corruption. So that's one thing that needs to be worked on. The second point that also you touched upon is the stability of laws and Plan A and Plan B and Plan C. I believe that an 80% working plan that is implemented is much better than a 100% perfect plan that's still on the drawing board. Thank you.
Thank you. And Hania?
My question is how long it actually took before your people felt the impact of your reform on their daily life? Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. The way I will go about handling this question, I'll give you some time to think. However, I just want to give the chance to Salma and Muhammad to have, because there are questions related to Jordan, Dr. Muhammad, and I know that you could have handled this. Salma, final word, and then I'll move for you to wrap it up and to finish with your statement. So please, Salma.
So maybe final remarks from my side, and thank you for the opportunity. First, the key message, as I mentioned in my opening remarks, that we stand ready to continue to support the government of Jordan on very important reforms, in particular in the area of business enabling environment, which are quite a high priority for the government of Jordan as part of the 5-year growth plan. Something that I didn't mention to any level of detail is something that it's both a sort of a challenge, also a lesson, something that we're taking operationally into account when we are designing new reform programs together with our government counterparts, is that we all know that a lot of these reforms there are multi-agency, multi-ministerial type of reforms which require a lot of coordination, which we are seeing not only in this region but also globally as one of the key challenges. And that is sort of a technical challenge, if you will, that we are finding ways together with our client governments to bypass by establishing different inter-ministerial cooperation mechanisms. So that's a technicality. That will not happen unless, I wanted to go back to the point that His Excellency has made about this managing expectations, and what I would even add, a shared vision of what is a joint vision of success of the different agencies that are involved in the reform process. And a consultative process with the private sector who will in the end benefit or be constrained with the outcome of these reform processes. So if these things that are related to sort of the visioning and the technicalities of putting together mechanism for coordination, I don't think we will move the needle and have a successful reform. So this is something that I wanted to also mention that I didn't have a chance to do
Thank
in
you.
the beginning. Yep.
Well, speaking of coordination, clearly this whole is not well coordinated actually. Somebody is working while we're chatting. Dr. Muhammad.
These are the opponents of the public sector report.
But they need to better coordinate.
They're intentional. I think I would say for a public sector reform, and this probably could answer some of the questions or the comments that we've heard about, ensuring that it really sticks and becomes sustainable. There are so many points, but the most important one is probably having a workable governance structure of the reform. And the notion that I believe in and I recommend is, and indulge me here, I still don't believe genuinely that governments can reform themselves. I don't even believe that they can create plans, let alone implementation. So the best way to do this one, in my view, is to create...
There is a leadership that are dedicated to do that reform?
I think in my view is the best thing to do is to have it outside the government, just to leave the government to implement. But the planning and the setting of the policy and even measuring the performance should not be from within the government, should be from outside the government. So something like a wise man council, private sector, government, ex-ministers, third-party think tanks, Georgian people, Singaporean people, just to come in and help set the strategy, the direction, and the planning. And then let the execution be at the ministerial level. So if a minister or a prime minister changes tomorrow, it continues. The plan is the plan. It's not acceptable to change the plan. To improve it, yes, but not to change it. The second one is implementation. It's very, very important. The governments will fail to implement because they really don't have an incentive to implement, and it's very difficult. They lack capacity as well. There is their day-to-day job plus this transformation effort that requires an army to do. So it's not part of their daily job. And this is a challenge, but it's an opportunity in my view. I look at Jordan, I look at the private sector, I look at the youth and our people there. I look and I say, there is an opportunity. Give it to the private sector, please. Outsource it. Let them help you. This will create jobs. This will promote growth. And we will bring in elements of the private sector performance management into the implementation. These are the service-oriented people that need to do this. If we cannot shrink the government size, at least let's not grow it. And if we can do that, that would be great. That would be fantastic. These are the few of the elements that I think we need, and as well as financials, which Adam mentioned. It has to be multi-year. So something related to a medium-term framework, إطار around our budget. It's very important. Yearly budget, and for the next 2 or 3 years, تأشيرية, it's not enough. And again, it's a challenge. We don't have money. We understand that. We have debt. But it's also an opportunity. Give it to the people who can generate and can promote and can give you revenue. So we do have in Jordan a good chance still to do this. Because we do have the people and the capacity and the talent and the innovation to do it. Let's not just keep beating a dead horse. It's not going to work.
Thank you. Thank you. Adam, do you have a final word to say? Your last chance.
I'll leave you with one or two just quick thoughts and then turn over to His Excellency. So in 1976, a fiscal plan was developed for Puerto Rico. And if you ignored the fact that it was done on a typewriter, the diagnosis of the problems are exactly the same that the Commonwealth is dealing with today. And so what's different now than what was different in 1976? And by the way, the 17 remaining fiscal plans that have been developed for that government. The difference today is the focus on implementation and execution. And there's multiple ways that the government is trying to do that. One of the ways that I'll leave you with as my parting thought is to share in the gains and share in the savings with the public sector workforce that has to implement that change. it's so critical that the workforce understands that they are a part of this transformation, that they will benefit from this transformation, and it is not a threat to their jobs and to their livelihoods. And that takes a fundamental shift, and by investing in those people, a good example, we generated significant savings through tough decisions, closing schools in Puerto Rico because there are far fewer young people on the island today than there were 10 years ago. But the savings generated went in part to increase teacher salaries, to invest in textbooks, to reinvest in the physical and capital infrastructure of the schools. And so by making the public sector workforce a part of the transformation, you can better enable its actual implementation, which is so critical.
Thank you. Thanks, Ed. Nick, please.
First of all, I would like to make some comments about Mohammed's belief in government to change or not to change. First of all, I agree with you that the best formula is through outsourcing and through involving private sector. But in order for you to restore your belief in the fact that governments can change, I would like to give you this book. Which actually shows that governments can change. Not many, but some of them. To give the answers about the questions, let me start first with shadow economy. I think this is one of the important ones. Yes, shadow economy was the big problem in Georgia. Yes, I believe shadow economy is the big problem in this country as well, because these countries in the developing world, in this level of GDP per capita, do suffer from this very bad illness, I would call it economic illness. Few reforms that helped us. One was, first of all, please calculate, and I'm sure EY can do that amazingly well, calculate, can private sector pay all the taxes and stay in business at the same time? When we did the calculations in Georgia, we realized that 21 taxes, if SME would pay all the taxes, they would go out of business, or they had to increase their prices to that level which was not sustainable for that GDP per capita. So for every GDP per capita, there is sustainability of tax burden. And in most of the cases in this world, there's a mismatch. That's one. Second, we abandoned all earmarking of taxation. We adopted one budget principle. So there is no earmark. For example, many countries have tourism tax. All tourists have to pay taxes for tourism, and this money goes to tourism development. Or road tax. Or I don't know, I really haven't studied Jordan in this direction, but I don't know if you have it or not. We had like 12 taxes like that, specific taxes. It doesn't work. The earmarking creates shadow. It's one more reason which creates shadow economy, by the way. We abandoned all these taxes. We have only 6 taxes, which is VAT, income tax, property tax, profit tax, corporate profit tax, excise tax on cigarettes and alcohol, and customs duties. Only 3 different customs duty percentages. So abandoning this kind of earmarking also helped to fight against shadow economy. Then we had some administrative reforms. One of them was actually lottery that you mentioned, that everybody that was buying any product, getting a check, this check had a lottery number, which was once a week there was prizes, cash prizes for everybody. It helped us with getting population involved in this. Then we had outsourced. We outsourced to public, saying that you can be our mystery shopper. And we gave them like 1 week course, we gave them license, and they were running around and earning money based on government revenues from whatever they would bring in. By the way, this was amazing reform for first 6-9 months, then they went crazy. Then they were earning so much and they were pushing so hard that we had to abandon this. But for first 6 to 9 months it worked. I think one of the craziest ideas that we had, which we actually implemented, was we outsourced tax department. We actually outsourced partially tax department. We said that if a big company, and we kind of identified the first initial number of companies, if a big company wants to be checked by tax department, they can write to me, I was Minister of Finance back then, they can write to me a letter saying that I want to be checked by Big Four. And this is where new business came towards Ernst & Young and Pricewaterhouse and others in this business. I want to be checked by them. I gave these 4 companies license to check on behalf of tax department, but I left to myself a kind of right to recheck once every 10. If Ministry of Finance finds some wrongdoing, we fine the auditor, we fine the company, and we take away the license.
Blacklist, yeah.
Why this was an amazing reform? Because we realized that the best auditors are not in public sector. Best auditors are with Ernst & Young and with Big Four because they pay better. So what we did, and then we created the tax kind of resolution, tax resolution department, which was chaired by Ministry of Finance, and it was the best event because best auditors were fighting against best auditors of private sector versus private sector, to try to prove to each other who was right. And do you know what happened? That's where we found out where the problematic issues of tax code were. Because in some cases, both of them were right. Because tax code was vague. And that's how we perfected tax code, because of these discussions and because of these debates. And in this case, what was amazing in this case that Ministry of Finance couldn't have possibly checked so many companies in 1 year that was done in that particular year. Because, take it or not, Revenue Department or Ministry of Finance is still aggressive sector, aggressive institution. And private sector would rather have Ernst & Youngs and others to come and check with them on behalf of tax department, and they are ready to pay for it. Then to allow Ministry of Finance to go in, kind of lock everything down and try to use their force instead of their brain. I'm sorry for that, but mostly this is the case. So, I mean, this type of out-of-box reforms helped us to significantly reduce the shadow economy. And by the way, do you know can you measure that? And you can measure any economy's shadow economy by productivity of VAT or productivity of your income tax. What percent of GDP is collected by 1% of VAT? What percent of GDP is collected by 1% of income tax? And measure that vis-a-vis more or less clean countries. Right now, I can tell you that more or less clean country is Georgia. So if you measure that, you will see what is the balance is shadow economy. Okay? To go ahead, PPP was a question about PPP. I believe PPPs can go wrong, and I've seen many PPPs went wrong. It's like a bad marriage when you cannot get out of it, but you don't want to stay in it. Don't get me wrong, I'm very happily married with 3 kids, but I've seen bad PPPs, and mostly PPPs went wrong are because of corruption, one, or untransparency, or uncompetitiveness of the process. If you will have properly good formulas for PPPs, which is transparent, open, and competitive, it's the best thing for governments to move forward and for governments to attract FDI. And why FDI is important? It's not only important because of current account deficit or because of inflow of funds. It is important because of transfer of know-how and transfer of technologies, because we live in the era where technologies will determine future of the countries, future of the economies. And this part of the world is not developing technologies. We are technology consumers. We need FDI, and through FDI we need to transfer the know-how and transfer the technology. That's why we need PPPs. We need PPPs in order to create a kind of environment for large, good, smart technological companies to transfer their know-hows and bring them to Jordan in your case, or to Georgia in my case. I'll just give you one example. We wanted to build new hydro in Georgia. Nobody wanted to invest. Then we did the following. We created a partnership fund. And the partnership fund, we created a special vehicle. Let's call it Hydro One. We gave to this Hydro One all the licenses, all the permits, land, connection, contract, because private sector hates this first part of the development. It takes long, it's burdensome, you have to interact with dozens of government agencies, whereas for government, it's like, in 1 month, I was prime minister, I told to one agency to give the license, I told to another agency to give the land, third agency to give a contract, and so in 1 month it was done. Plus, we invested some money in technological and in feasibility study, and then we announced a tender saying that which of you companies want to buy 51% of this company and build it with us. It's a PPP. We will put money as well. But 2 conditions. You're going to participate in auction, open auction, where winner will be determined by who wants more. We'll start from 51%. It goes up. Who goes to highest bid, he is the investor. And second condition, you need to buy me out in 5 years' time, because I want this money for new project. And I want to build PPP pipeline going forward, attracting FDI, attracting new technologies, and so on and so on. So PPP is an amazing formula, but be careful with that. If it goes wrong, you are stuck with the wrong company who is not happy with you, and you are not happy with him. And it can continue, it always ends up in courts or something like that, or government kicks them out, and it gives a bad name, a bad reputation to government. So PPP, if only can be done properly, if it's competitive selection, if it's transparently done and non-corrupt. There is no plan which works 100%. Do not try even to develop a plan which is perfect. Perfect plans do not exist, because the moment you start implement on the day 1, you will realize that the plan has faults, because there is no way you can find all the ways that are loopholes. Very simple. Do not be afraid to reform the reform. And you have to explain that to population. You cannot tell to population or to stakeholders that I came up with a perfect plan, it's going to work for perfect. No way. You're going to say that we came up with steps, next steps, which will show us what should be the next steps after that, because it cannot be perfect. And we're going to reform the reform.
Sustainability of reform.
Sustainability of reform, very good question. Yes and no. As I told you, we started with a super corrupt country. We went all the way to being one of the cleanest countries in the world. Okay, I have to tell you that corruption hasn't come back to that level, definitely, but it's crippling back. So we do have corruption in the government problem now. But it's not all the way that bad, okay? For example, we started with total blackouts in the energy sector because of corruption. Now we don't have blackouts, of course, but we see problematic issues in the energy sector. The thing is, the sustainability of good reforms definitely exists. And I can show you that, for example, in the past 10 years, even though with very weak government, sometimes with corruption issues, sometimes with management issues and so on, we still managed to float in top 10 in ease of doing government report. But our economic growth is almost none. In dollar terms, Georgia's economy hasn't grown at all in the past 7 years, in dollar terms. Why? No reforms, or weak reforms. So there is sustainability of reforms, definitely, of good reforms, it stays. But if governments do not keep reforming, the growth goes down. The momentum goes down. Everything. So, and you can actually see it in figures. During reform period, quadrupling Georgia's GDP per capita. Quadrupling in 9 years' time. in dollar terms. In past 7 years, same. Exactly same. No growth whatsoever. It's just part of the government's efforts. Is there anything else? Sorry? Sorry? Time to feel.
How long elapsed before the people felt the impact of the reform? Did they feel it immediately? They felt it, or?
That's a good question. Part of the people didn't feel even after 9 years. Part of the people population didn't feel even after 7, 9, 8 years, and this maybe was one of big mistakes. They did feel it, but at some point they felt it as a granted. So, for example, Georgia didn't have electricity, literally. We had a blackouts in 2003, 2004. In 2005, 2006, we had 24-hour supply. Of course, population felt it in the same day. Then population wouldn't even get pensions on time, and there was a 9 months or 12 months backlog of pensions, and they started receiving pensions. Of course, they felt it the same day. So there are some parts of reforms that population feels the same day, and they get used to that on the same day. On that day, they feel that that's how it should be. But what couldn't be felt by part of the population is that Georgia's economy quadrupled. They didn't feel quadrupling of their income. And this is something that has a time gap, I believe. I don't know how long. It depends on country to country, it depends on government to government. But what we were saying that, guys, Georgia's economy has quadrupled in nominal terms in past 9 years, population didn't feel quadrupling their income. And most likely they couldn't have felt it. And they felt that there was some mismatch. There was either government was lying or they couldn't, where this money went. So there is a time gap between these reforms, between growth and between when population will actually feel this kind of growth. So,
the final question was regarding the political reform and economic reform.
Political reform?
Whether you can do economic reform without having a political reform?
I don't know, honestly. I don't know for Jordan. I know for Georgia. That for Georgia, these two things have to go hand in hand. In case of Jordan, I don't know. I really.
Tariq insists on his question, so you want to.
Oh, sorry, banking sector. We had, unlike other Soviet Union countries, we had a very strange banking sector. We didn't have one state-owned bank. None of them. We had all private banks, so that's why we had a very strong competition. I believe that we had a very strong banking sector, which survived very well the world financial crisis. Our biggest banks are London IPO'd, and they are amongst top FTSE 250 companies. Their shareholding structure is like most of their shareholders are large institutional investors, world's biggest ones, Franklin Templetons and PIMCOs and the Schroders of the world. And their management structure is also very good. And plus our national bank was quite strict with capital adequacy ratios and so on and so on. Banking sector was a driver of growth because it was healthy. It was an engine of the growth. Our non-performing loans, for example, was something like 4 to 5% or even less. So yes, because this lending, insider lending, was almost non-existent, and there was a good competition. What is interesting is that many international banks came in, but they couldn't grow, despite the fact that they had big names. Few months ago, I was having a similar event in other country. I will not name the country. And I was told by the biggest bank CEOs that we do not want international banks to come to our country because they will eat us. Not the case, believe me. When international banks come in, only thing they bring in extra competition. which gives better services to population, better services to private sector, and allows the local banks to grow even faster. So I think the formula for banking sector in our case was zero government banks, good, clean competition, very strict National Bank of Georgia, and these IPOs work. They can bring capital easily, easier than non-IPO'd banks. So IPO'd banking system is very, very strong driver of economic growth because they bring capital on top of whatever government can actually manage. And they are becoming kind of extra agents of advertising your country. Whenever they are going on roadshow, trying to bring capital or trying to raise bonds or something like that. So it was very strong in our case. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. And let me just, towards the end, just thanks again. I think we're done with the timing, so we can have a break now. I know you have still a long day ahead of you.
Yes.
So thank you very much for your presence. Thank for our panelists for their contribution. Thanks for EY for giving us this platform to discuss this. Thank you very much for your being.